All right, friends, from Micah chapter 7, getting a little bit of feedback. You might want to turn me down. I get excited. All right, that's good. Thank you. All right, from Micah chapter 7, verses 14 through 17, listen now for the word of our Lord. Shepherd your people with your staff, the flock that belongs to you, which lives alone in a forest in the midst of a garden land. Let them feed in Bashan and Gilead as in the days of old. As in the days when you came out of the land of Egypt, show us marvelous things. The nations shall see and be ashamed of all their might. They shall lay their hands on their mouths, their ears shall be deaf. They shall lick dust like a snake. Like the crawling things of the earth, they shall come trembling out of their fortresses. They shall come in dread to the Lord our God, and they shall stand in fear of you. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So, opening once again from our book today, The Good Samaritan Bites the Dust, the amazing way the Bible influences our everyday language. All right, we got this. In the Bible, dust means death. Unto dust shalt thou return, says God to Adam when he cuts him off from the Garden of Eden and the tree of life. They shall lie down alike in the dust, and the worms shall cover them, says the book of Job. But although bite the dust sounds biblical and is often listed as a biblical phrase, the closest the Bible comes to that precise wording is lick the dust, which appears in Psalms and Micah as an expression of abasement and humiliation. Licking doesn't turn to biting until as late as 1750, and the saying only takes off when it becomes a favorite cowboy catchphrase in the Wild West adventure stories of the 19th century period. From there, it was adopted by RAF pilots in the Second World War and their short life expectancies. They needed a lot of euphemisms for to die. The real high point for the expression comes in 1980 when a track called Another One Bites the Dust became a massive hit for glam rock megastars Queen. Not that the song actually had that much to do with death. In fact, some especially attentive listeners claimed the record's real message could only be heard if you played it backwards. Well, you guys know this. It's fun to smoke marijuana. I see who my rock heads were. So the example from our book today reads, Asha dreaded her husband's get-rich-quick schemes, which never lasted longer than a week before invariably biting the dust. Now, most of us, when we hear the word Micah, that book which we read from today, we think of Micah chapter 6, verse 8, to do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God. And that is one very short verse in which God tells Israel exactly how to redeem themselves, how to come back after leading themselves astray, and God's punishment of them. So Micah reminds the people shortly before our text today of a story in Numbers. Numbers is the book that follows Exodus. You remember Exodus is when Moses led his people out of Egypt. And there's a story in there when King Balak had asked pagan prophet named Balaam, you might remember Balaam's donkey, to curse Israel. And God sent an adversary to stop Balaam and commanded him not to curse Israel whatsoever. But Balaam, he's sneaky and he finds a loophole. So he figured he didn't have to curse the people of Israel. They would curse themselves. And he sends immoral people down into the camp to tempt them into actions of disobedience. And it worked. Israel did curse themselves just by being tempted. And so it fell into a state very displeasing to God. They had neglected to care for the earth. They didn't produce a harvest. The people had begun to quarrel with one another. Children stopped listening to their parents. They were very disrespectful. The politicians and leaders had become selfish and greedy, and now enemies were at their doorstep, threatening to conquer them once again. Does that sound a little familiar to where we are? God, you can come now. People had lost trust in one another. They had begun locking their doors. Israel had become distracted by these people and therefore corrupted. And no wonder God was ready to just throw up his hands. After all that God had done for them, after all the ways God had blessed them, they were a mess, and a mess of their own making. So Micah, in chapter 6, that's the chapter before today, God makes a case against Israel and leaves the prophet Micah feeling distressed and depressed. And when we come to Micah chapter 7, verse 1, here he begins to pray. He prays that the Lord will shepherd them into a brand new era in which they will overcome all of the things that had once hindered them. He begins by confessing his own sins. And then he understands God's anger with him and with his people. He says, God, your anger is just. And he knows that they must change their ways and that only with God's help are they going to find their way out of this and be redeemed and made new. And so his words, they point forward actually to some words in Revelation which speak of a new heaven and a new earth and a new Jerusalem. He knows that the old ways and the old things have got to die in order for them to make room for what is coming. And he knows that it is only with God's help that they are going to accomplish these things. They cannot do it by themselves. Now, he sees God as the one true advocate for Israel, as God has always been. And this points forward. You can see very clearly the connection between the Old Testament and the New Testament here. He's pointing forward to Christ's eventual purpose. Come, redeem us, save us from the ways that we have fallen into. And so it is Christ who in Matthew chapter 10 says this after listing the very same sins that Micah had listed they were doing. Jesus says, "Whoever loves the father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever loves a son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever does not take up his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Whoever finds his life will lose it. And whoever loses his life because of me will find it." Now, earlier in that same chapter, in Matthew chapter 10, in verse 14, Jesus tells his disciples to go out and spread the good news. And quite frankly, if you asked me what my favorite passage was, this would probably have to be it. Go out and spread the good news, but if you are not received, then shake the dust off your feet and keep walking. That is to say, shake the things that no longer serve you or serve God and continue forward. Dust does not serve our sandals. Dust is dead weight. Dust is death. Now, it is interesting to me how dust is used throughout the Bible. As you noted, we were familiar with the dust of Ash Wednesday, the reminder that we come from dust and to dust we shall return. And right there, that is enough confirmation to say that the symbol of dust throughout the Bible is death. It is the one lifeless thing that is mentioned over and over. And so to lick dust, to taste death, is to come so intimate with that place of choice. Now, each of us has been there. I want you to remember a time, and this isn't going to be pleasant, but remember a time when you had hit rock bottom. Everything had stopped going your way. Maybe you were ashamed of yourself. You felt defeated, hopeless, and done. It was probably a very dark time in your life, probably not one that you like to revisit or like to remember. But then I want you to remember when it was that moment that you made the choice that you weren't going to die there. You weren't going to let this be the end of your story. What did you do to get moving again? When was it that you were determined to put one foot in front of the other, no matter how long it took, no matter how hard it was, and change your own situation? Did you pray? And from where did your help come? That is strength. That is courage. When you have hit rock bottom and you have made that decision to look up to God in prayer and say, get me out of here. I'll change. I'll do what I need to do. Help me. That sentence, help, is probably the strongest sentence one could ever utter. And making that decision to change, that's dynamite. Now, I would argue that in Micah chapter 6, Israel had hit rock bottom. And it was about to lick dust itself when God came along and said to them effectively, check yourselves before you wreck yourselves. You can do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with me, or you can die to everything that you have ever worked for, and you can languish here without me. That is the blessing. When we think that we have hit rock bottom completely, there's only one way, right? Up. So when we find ourselves in that place of hopelessness and despair, when we have hit rock bottom, we can either die or we can let go of the things that took us to that place. And we can rise with God's helping hand, which is always outstretched for us. And there's a movie that I especially enjoy with Rachel McAdams called Morning Glory. And some of you might have seen it. It's a little bit older, I admit. It's the early 2000s. And it is PG-13 for those of you with kids. But it's about a young woman in the news industry who gets laid off from her local position as a small town assistant to the news producer. And she is young by society's standards. She's maybe 30 years old. And in the workforce, unfortunately, by the time you've hit 30, you should be a lot more accomplished than where she was. And here she was now without a job, without any prospects, and without any support. She was completely alone. And so she goes to her mother, and her mother tells her, just give up. Do something you know you're going to succeed in. This is ridiculous. But instead, she sits down and she takes out the newspaper and she circles every ad in the classifieds for anything to do with news producing positions. And she waits weeks, maybe months pass by, and she doesn't get a call. And then finally, she gets called to an interview in New York City. Now, the interviewer, played by Jeff Goldblum, tells her about the struggling show Daybreak. And he tells her that this show is maybe watched by, perhaps 7 old ladies whose remotes broke and they couldn't turn the TV off anymore. And that maybe the show would better serve the public if the show just simply no longer existed. And then he comes to tell her that their budget is gone. The ratings have plummeted so low, he didn't know that there could be negative beyond negative ratings. And then he tells her if she would like to become the news producer for Daybreak, she could, but he'd strongly advise her against this position. Now, as though she didn't hear a single word that he had just said, she excitedly accepts the position, jumping up into the air off of 6-inch heels. I don't know how Rachel McAdams does it. And birds are flying everywhere. And suddenly, the music begins. She's off to this new job. She's excited. She reports to the studio the very next day to find that a portion of the staff is corrupt. Others were frustrated but hanging on because they were locked into a contract that they can't get out of. And she finds utter chaos. She's not met with any sort of genuine welcome. And the staff there believe that she's going to be gone within a week tops. And therefore, they don't pay her any mind. They saw themselves as the Stepping Stone Network. Now, on her very first day, she walks in and she goes into a meeting. There's no order to it. And she decides right off the bat to fire their leading news anchor. And then only after that, she dives into the budget and finds out, there's absolutely no money to hire a new news anchor. And so she's told repeatedly that she's going to fail. And since this is her very first time serving in such a management role, there truly is no hope for the show, and she should just cut her losses and leave. She's too young, she's too naive, and she's just too new. So the next day, She goes through all of the company's legal agreements, and she spends all day and all night into the next workday, and she finds a glimmer of hope when she finds there a little loophole in the contract agreement they have, and she can hire Harrison Ford's character from upstairs to be the other news anchor. Now, he makes things difficult. He's an old curmudgeon at this point. He just wants out, and he says, "What a diss to put me on the morning news. That's not news. That's making frittatas," right? And so she brings Harrison Ford in, and he and Diane Keaton's character cannot get along. They start bickering on the air, calling each other names, stealing each other's lines, and refusing to give it up. They start requesting expensive fruit plates to their different dressing rooms, and all of these crazy ways to get all of the madness to stop and go back to what they were. Hopeless, but content with the situation, nobody's pride hurt. And Rachel, at this point, her character, she just wants to absolutely scream. These supposed experienced adults are acting like total toddlers. And the show is still in the crapshoot, and no one is on the same page, and they've been trying to force these square blocks into these triangular holes of tradition. That was the issue. So Rachel, she taps into her own creativity, and she combines it with the staff's need to let loose. And she lets them step beyond the limits that they've known, using their skills and interests and talents to boost the experiences of news reporting. The weatherman actually goes outside the studio, and he begins reporting the weather from the top of roller coasters. And the news anchors, the female news anchor, she tries new things and adds humor to awkward situations, such as kissing toads on air or trying new foods. She even gets into a mud wrestling jam. And the anchors and the camera crews finally get out of that box of a studio, and they find new ways to engage the world, trying daring new endeavors and sharing life with the world. And the news station had left the building. Now, have you guys heard a phrase similar to that? Maybe it was on a t-shirt here for like 20 years. The church has left the building, right? And so here she is. She gets the studio to leave the building, and what she discovers is that both the staff and their potential viewers were craving the very same thing. And her new show, Daybreak, was once again on the rise as they let their natural candor and gifts for creative journalism light up the morning hours of news. And to the network's surprise, the show actually becomes an absolute hit. And Rachel's character is called in to another interview. And this time it's her dream job. She gets called in to the set of the Today Show. Now, as she's sitting there in the interview, her own program is running on the televisions, and she can see it out of the corner of her eye. Being a producer, she's very attuned to what's happening. And what she sees for the first time is Harrison Ford's character actually show her subtle signs of love. He's very clearly communicating through his actions on set that he doesn't want her to leave. They were no longer the stepping stone news show for aspiring producers. They had become the place that people actually wanted to work for. They had been restored to the metaphorical sense of their homeland and made to shine. Their behaviors of yesterday had died to them, and they had embraced this new system of being. And they found happiness in the company of one another and the thrill of taking a risk and finding blessings in abundance. Humility, forgiveness, risk, and love. It gave them new life. It gave them a new Jerusalem to play in. That is the blessing. When we hit rock bottom, and we extend our tongues to lick that dust there. If we are willing to take a risk and reach back out for the outstretched hand of God, making ourselves humble, confessing our wrongdoings, committing to change, we too can find blessings in abundance through embracing the things which would bring us life, the things which we once looked at and maybe thought were crazy. I bet some of you thought it was pretty crazy today to come dancing up to Queen and receive ashes, and it's not even Ash Wednesday, am I right? We are Presbyterian, we are the frozen chosen. What is happening here, right? Now, it is easy to say that if we have faith, if we only have faith in God, we cannot fail because God is for us. God will provide. Well, yeah, God provides, but we can't just say that and do nothing. God provides, but we have to put in the work. You see, faith, a lot of people think of faith as something that sits still, something that is calm and tranquil and beautiful. No, faith is hard work. Faith is sweat. Faith is taking a risk where you think the odds are impossible, but remember, God will provide. It is hard to admit when we have failed or when we have done wrongly. It is harder still to be humble and to be open to new things. And even more than that, we can peer through the door of opportunity and the door of possibility, and we can see risk as this giant, scary, hairy monster that's growling at us. But God asks us to walk through that door and take the hand of that monster. Because God is there, walking right next to us. Now, we will not always succeed. There is no guarantee. That's why risk is risk. We will always make mistakes. It's part of being human. That's part of learning. And it's totally okay to make as many mistakes as we can, as long as we're always making new mistakes. You see, if we're repeating the same old mistakes, then we're just holding on to the dust on our sandals, the things that do not serve us, those things that need to fall off and die, the things that need to bite the dust. And that is the dust that we have to shake from our sandals as we walk to our next destination. Let us do so with confidence. You remember the song, Another One Bites the Dust, and how confident that makes you feel? Everybody up, shaking, dancing, right? That's the confidence God wants us to dance to our next destination. Shake it all off. God is with us, and with God with us, we are gonna go places. When we've hit rock bottom, we're not gonna stay there. And as we shed the things that no longer serve us, singing boldly, another one bites the dust, we're gonna step with bravery. We're gonna step with joy. And each step is gonna be a little bit lighter as we shed the things of yesteryear that no longer serve to propel us forward. And each risk, it's not gonna be scary, it's gonna be another adventure, right? Each mistake is not going to be a failure, but it's going to be a thrilling way to learn something new. God is calling us into the time of restoration, into a time of growth, into a time of untamed beauty and splendor in the light and warmth of God's love and mercy. God is here. We need not lick the dust of rock bottom, but while we are down there and on our knees, let us look up to God and ask humbly for his help. With his hand and his spirit, with faith and courage and trust, we will thrive in the light of God's love. Amen.